Hello there. Welcome to the SAROY channel. I just want to send love to each and every one of you. You're all very special to me, and I really appreciate your support to my channel. You guys all really rock, and I really mean that from the bottom of my heart. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my Bigfoot encounter happened in the year 2003 when I went to stay with my sister and her husband in America. And I also have a ghost story that might be of interest to your listeners, as I know people are fascinated by the paranormal these days, and I'm no exception to that rule. I grew up in Oxford, England, with my younger sister Kate in a single-parent home, as my mother got divorced from my father when I was only 3 years old. I'm sure your listeners know that Oxford is a historic old town with a youthful, vibrant ambience that is steeped in history, and it is a place that is alive with cobbled streets, young students, pubs, interesting shops, and of course a very distinguished university that draws students from all over the world. My sister and I grew up in a very old Victorian home, a mere bicycle ride from the bustling town. The house had been converted into 3 individual homes that were stacked very close together, and from the moment we moved in we experienced paranormal activity, like drafts coming into the room on a warm day, and the sounds of footsteps running up and down the staircase. I was 5 and my younger sister was 4. At the time, my mother thought that I had an invisible friend because I would always be talking to someone that she couldn't see. I would play for hours with a little girl wearing a white dress with a green sash around her waist and white shoes. All these years later, I remember her so very clearly. She told me that her name was Susan Price and that she had died from falling down the large wooden staircase in our home. I remember thinking that this dead friend of mine was as real as a living being, because even though it was strange she could just vanish in a flash of light, like a light switch being turned off, it would always puzzle me that my mother could never physically see her. When my sister Kate turned 5, she also started to play with little Susan, and also remembers the experience almost as vividly as I do. She recalls waking up in the middle of the night to see Susan sitting at the end of the bed, wanting to play with us. It would seem that the little girl never got physically tired, nor did she ever get any older. One day my mother was washing dishes in the kitchen sink when she thought she saw a 5-year-old girl swinging on my swing set out on the lawn with one of my white teddy bears perched on her lap. My mother wondered who this mystery girl was and what she was actually doing in our yard, so she went outside to talk to the little girl and ask her where her mother was. Not for a moment did my mother consider that this girl was not real, but she did think that the dress that the girl was wearing was incredibly fancy. As she approached the swing, the little girl seemed to fade and then suddenly dissolved before her eyes, like a water bubble that floats in the air and then pops and then is finally gone. She could hardly believe what she'd actually seen, and she thought her imagination was playing tricks on her. And then she saw my white teddy bear that had fallen underneath the swing set, and it appeared to be moving. In that moment, she knew that she had actually seen a ghost. It was after that event that my mother quizzed me about my invisible friend, and she checked the details against the history of our home. And indeed, there was a girl called Susan Price that had fallen down a staircase in an accident and died when she was 5 years old during the Victorian era. Susan Price was soon to disappear from my life when I got a little older. Maybe by then I was a lot less sensitive to her presence and could no longer see her anymore. Or maybe she had withdrawn from my life because I was that much older. What we did notice, though, was that when young people came to our home who were about 5 years old, they appeared to be able to play with someone that the adults couldn't see, and neither could we anymore, which saddened me immensely. I do believe emphatically that they were playing with little Susan. Sometimes in our home we would experience a much more menacing presence. It did not really make any sense to us until we were a little older. Once my sister Kate was a little bit older, at about 9 years old, she was walking down the steps and she felt a freezing cold hand touching her back, and for a moment she felt certain that something wanted to push her over. For a long while it appeared that my sister was the target of a very formidable dark force. Kate was so terrified because in her bedroom at night she could swear she saw a dark shadow and heard a disembodied voice, and even woke up with an unexplained bruising and scratching on her body. There were also times when her duvet cover would slide off her bed mysteriously, only to be found lying in a crumpled heap on the living room floor, which was a fair way away from the bedroom. One day my mother was having a few girlfriends at home and hosting a book club gathering to discuss the most recent book that she'd been reading. One of her girlfriends, who she did not know at the time, was a psychic who told my mother that there was a little girl sitting at the end of the stairs called Susan, who was watching us with a keen interest and listening in to the conversation. My mother asked this friend why Susan was still here in our home and why she hadn't moved on. Her girlfriend told my mother that Susan was trapped here by her uncle, who had pushed her down the stairs when she was little, and he was determined to keep her stuck in this location. He was blocking her from crossing over and was a very hostile, disagreeable man who didn't like children at all. "I'm surprised you're not having problems with this nasty man," she said. "I would have thought he could potentially be a problem for your children." My mother then told her about the incident at the stairs, where my sister had felt a cold hand on her back, and also about the scratches and duvet being pulled off her bed. That was when my mother's friend told us that even though this man was not demonic, he wasn't very nice, and he might get more volatile in the future, so we needed to make sure that he left our home, not only for the safety of my sister, but also to set poor little Susan free. It was then that my mother arranged for a priest to come to our home to bless the place, along with a medium who would get the spirits to leave our home. A few days before their visit, things got a little crazy in our home, and the activity escalated, because I think the horrible uncle knew that he would be forced to leave very soon. We had a vase of flowers flung across the living room, and it had been on a very flat surface, so there was no explanation for that. It crashed into thousands of pieces and was literally scattered all over our cream carpet, along with all the flowers and the water. Then a picture of my sister and I was hurled off the wall violently in an expression of rage, and the glass frame was completely shattered. At the time, the frame had narrowly missed hitting my sister Kate, so she was clearly being targeted by this nasty uncle. We also found kitchen cabinets were flung open on their own accord, and when we switched the television off to return to bed at night, it was turned on almost immediately. The medium was a tiny woman called Hope. I think she was about 4 foot tall, with a little portly frame, wispy grey hair that was tied back in a bun, and a face that was as gentle as a doe. By contrast, the priest was 6 foot tall, thin and lanky, with a receding hairline and big brown earnest hazel eyes. He was wearing his priestly robes and clutching a bottle of holy water in his hands, looking a little anxious and very much on edge. We were to find out later that the last blessing that he had done on a recent home had been exceedingly violent, and the dark presence had literally lashed out at him violently, and he'd been pushed over by this formidable force. "It's going to be fine," Howard assured the medium. "I can sense that this energy may be angry and afraid, but I promised you it's not evil, so you're going to be fine tonight." My mother told the medium about the escalation in activity that we'd been experiencing, and she wasn't surprised by those revelations. She said that the menacing uncle was a very lost, confused and frightened soul. He was absolutely terrified of crossing over and getting to the other side, because he believed in hell or purgatory, because he had done some bad things in his earthly life and was frightened of being condemned. He had clung to Susan like a limpet because he didn't want to be entirely alone in his spiritual state. He wanted to share it with someone. He confessed he had pushed Susan over the stairs, but it wasn't to kill her intentionally, but because he'd been drinking on that day, and he was lashing out at his niece in a drunken rage. He had never been fond of children, but he would never purposely kill someone, he assured us. The medium asked him why he had targeted my little sister Kate so aggressively if that was the case. He told her that my sister was a spitting image of his mother, who had abused him during his earthly life, and he apologized then profusely for his actions. The medium seemed to calm down the uncle's negative energy that had been so draining and oppressive. My mother said you could literally feel it. My mother watched the medium envelop every corner of the house with a smoky aroma of sage, and the priest also scattered holy water all over the place and said some prayers while blessing the house. Then some large white candles were lit, and the medium asked the spirits to move towards the light, and she said that the little girl had stretched her hand towards the reluctant, frightened uncle, and then they had both walked towards the light, and vanished. My mother said she never physically saw anything, but she had felt the heaviness just lift, and the house became so much lighter and incredibly bright. I remember feeling sad that Susan had gone, because she had been so much a part of my young life growing up, but I knew that she deserved to be free. Besides, our house did feel so much better without the oppressive energy from the angry uncle. I was also happy that he had moved on and hopefully found peace in a better place. My Bigfoot encounter is a whole other story, and growing up in England, I knew nothing about the hairy man. Sadly, that subject is not really discussed there. Neither did my sister know about him. In truth, we virtually knew nothing about American culture, apart from the fact that we knew it was a country that we loved and would long to visit someday in the future. One day at Oxford University, where my sister was doing an English degree, she was introduced to a delightful American literary student called Keith, and the rest is history. They fell in love, got married, and then both moved to America. My sister and her husband moved to a beautiful home in Chippewa County, which was about 15 miles from the city of Chippewa Falls. They bought a large plot of land there that was under about 200 acres, with about 75 acres of tillable timber, and then there were woods for hunting activities, as well as a large silvery lake providing about 290 feet of river frontage. It was pretty much anything and everything that my sister had ever dreamed of, and living in America was a whole new experience for her. I just cannot get over the space and the wilderness, she would tell me. It's like everything just goes on forever and ever, and that there is no beginning or end. It is so wonderful here. It was not long before I found myself going over to America, and there I was driving down a large gravel road that was surrounded by pretty trees. It veered off to the right until I came to a very large gate, and the gate was wide open. I drove down a very large white gravel driveway until I reached the beautiful modern-style farmhouse that Keith had purchased with the land, and it had such a magic, rustic charm about it that drew me immediately. It had a large south-facing wooden panel windows and a massive wooden deck that overlooked the ravishing views over the countryside. It had manicured lawns seamlessly blended into a vast area of natural forest. It was all utterly breathtaking. That evening we sat outside and enjoyed the starlit night and the light of the full moon around a crackling fire, and my sister and I shared our ghost stories with her husband, who listened intently with amazement about our story about Susan in our childhood. The night was utterly beautiful, and we could hear the croaks of frogs and the chorus of crickets and the sounds of coyotes. Suddenly we heard these strange whooping sounds, and I asked my sister's husband what they were, and he had absolutely no idea. I told him the calls sounded exactly like primates, and he laughed at me and told me that there were no such things as primates living in America. The following day, because of the time zone differences, which had left me feeling very disorientated, I slept in most of the morning, and my sister understood the fogginess I was feeling, so she actively encouraged me to sleep off all those sluggish feelings, and that's exactly what I did. The only problem was that later in the evening, after my sister and her husband had retreated to bed, I was left feeling wide awake and alert, and the last thing I wanted to do was to actually go to sleep. It was 12:30 and I was drinking a glass of wine by the fire pit, enjoying the crackling fire and listening to all the lovely animal sounds. It was a light, very beautiful evening, and it was so enchanting here, I thought, secretly envying my sister's brand new life here in America. Maybe I should marry an American, I thought. I quite fancied a life like this. Suddenly at that moment I heard those strange whooping sounds again, and it truly sounded as if they were coming from not too far away. And they did sound like a monkey or a gorilla. It was incredibly weird. I was naturally curious by nature and intrigued, so armed with my sister's flashlight and a pair of walking shoes, I ventured into that wooded area, listening out for all those whooping sounds. The further I walked, the louder the sounds became, so I knew that I was getting closer to the source. I could also hear these strange sounds of wood being knocked. Not once did I consider the possibility that I could be in danger. Coming from England, I was not adverse to going exploring in the night, and I truly thought nothing about it. I walked for a while, crunching leaf litter and twigs under my feet, and enjoying the serenity of this beautiful, intriguing night that appeared to have become unusually quiet. I could not hear the frogs or crickets or owls any more, but I was none the wiser, so I ventured towards the whooping sounds, which were the only audible calls that I could actually hear. Suddenly I heard a loud rustling sound, and then a large, long form of about 4 to 5 feet off the ground started growling at me. I could also sense the eyes of a predator on me, and I stepped back in utter horror as my flashlight observed the face of a large cat-like creature glaring at me with blazing eyes and a mouth that curled back to reveal sharp canine teeth. I saw that next to this cat was 2 young cubs that were tearing into the flesh of a large deer carcass that the mother had recently killed because it was pretty much still intact. I knew at once that I was in a life-threatening situation because there is nothing more protective than a mother and her cubs. I had heard stories of people being killed by mountain lions before, so I knew that I was in very big trouble. My heart was pounding violently in my chest, and I was walking backwards as I watched the creature closely. As I moved backwards, the creature was lunging towards me, and I felt almost certain that I was dead. There was no way that I could possibly survive this. The next thing I knew was that this massive arm grabbed me, but I screamed so much because for a moment I thought it was the mouth of another mountain lion that I hadn't actually seen creeping behind me, and once again I screamed again and again. I could feel myself being carried in the arms of a very big creature 8 foot off the ground. I looked down at the body and saw this long dark hair, and I was convinced that I was in the arms of a great big bear. Could this get any worse, I wondered? I had been ripped away from a mountain lion into the arms of another dangerous predator. I knew bears could also kill people, so I was no better off. I remember my life flashed before me 100 miles an hour, and I could feel the tears pouring down my face. I felt this dreadful sadness that my life was invariably over, and I was just wondering how it would end when the creature just plonked me on the ground. I suddenly remembered that someone had told me that during a bear attack that you should play dead, and so I immediately fell on the ground and played dead. As I lay there, I could feel the bear shaking my body, and it was so hard not to scream out in terror, but I knew I needed to be as still as possible, and it was the hardest thing I've ever done in my entire life. Truly, I think it is so much better to run, because lying still when you're beyond terrified is a virtual impossibility. The next thing I heard was this strange chattering sound that sounded like a monkey, and I felt this wet tongue on my face like a dog licking me, and I could smell the taste of ribeye steak on the saliva. The licking was odd behaviour for a bear, so I opened my eyes to find this strange hairy creature staring down at me with concerned brown eyes. But this was no bear. It was something else, but what on earth was it? The creature was absolutely enormous, and it was covered in dark brown hair from head to toe, and it had a huge human-like face, a very distinct brow ridge, a flat nose, and an ape-like mouth. I noticed that the head was almost half moon-shaped, like an egg that kind of blended seamlessly into the large shoulders, with not much evidence of a neck. I got up slowly, watching the creature curiously, half expecting it to pounce on me, because this creature was so monstrously big, and about 9 feet tall, and 800 pounds. Yet as I raised myself off the ground, the creature started chattering excitedly. I think he was so pleased that I had seemingly risen from the dead, and he had been my hero. He looked like he was pleased with himself, but not once was he even remotely aggressive towards me, but seemed to be gentle and kind. I was astonished because this creature was huge. Imagine for a moment a little teddy bear and blow it up to 8 foot tall and 5 foot wide and cover it with black hair and see how intimidating that is. And that is what this thing was like. Give it flesh and blood and you are looking at something very seriously creepy and highly dangerous. I got up and looked at the creature, and he just stood there, watching me until I made my way back to the house. I looked at him through the kitchen window, and he continued watching the house for a minute or so, and then he disappeared into the forest, seemingly gliding on his long, very agile legs. I promise you I was in awe. I could hardly believe what had just happened to me. I rushed into my sister's room, violently trying to wake her up, and told her my story. Her husband listened with eyes that were as wide as saucers and a jaw that was dropping to the ground. "You are kidding, right?" he kept saying. "This is a joke." "No," I assured him. "This humanoid ape-like creature covered with hair saved my life tonight." "I cannot believe you went into those woods all on your own in the dark," said my sister. "Did you not think that could be a wee bit dangerous for you?" "No, it didn't occur to me," I said. "It saved you from a mountain lion," said my sister's husband, almost meditating on the words in absolute disbelief. "What was it she saw?" asked my sister. "You're American. You should know about these things." My sister's husband said the word Bigfoot under his breath, almost too low for us to hear. "What did you say?" asked my sister. "Bigfoot," he said. "You must have seen a Bigfoot." "Well, who or whatever is a Bigfoot?" asked my sister. "I'm glad he's out there if he's got our backs. It makes me feel a whole lot better." My sister's husband just sat there on the bed, almost frozen to the spot, and said, "Bigfoot? Who would have ever thought of it?" The next day my sister's husband told me never ever under any circumstances to ever tell anyone what I'd actually seen. "No one will ever believe you," he said. "It's an incredible story, but people with story like yours needs to keep their mouth shut. I don't want you to be the subject of ridicule." So there you are. That's my story, and I still cannot believe that my life was saved by this incredible creature. It is truly the most incredible experience of my entire life. My sister is so chuffed that there is a Bigfoot on her land with a heart of gold. She says she feels so safe knowing he's out there. I had an amazing time in America, but I didn't meet my knight in shining armour there. So I invariably married an Englishman, and I still live in Oxford, but not in the home where I grew up, but in another home that is 300 years old to date. But I still have not experienced any ghostly activity. From time to time I visit my sister's place, and I always long to get a sighting of the hairy man again that rescued me, but sadly he has remained pretty elusive since then. However, I am assured by my sister that the whooping sounds ever continue on her land. So there you are. That's my story. Well, I just want to thank you for that incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.